Welcome to session 2 on risk communication. This session is about engaging communities, and the first lecture in this series is about risk communication in practice. My name is Lisa Boden. I'm based at the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Security at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and I'll be taking you through this presentation. Just to revisit our main aims, why are we communicating in an emergency? First of all, people have the right to information to make better decisions about the health of their animals, the health of their livelihoods, and their own personal health. Communicating in an emergency is important for coordination and decision-making activities, and in particular, mobilization of resources when they're needed the most. Before creating a communication strategy, and we talked about communication strategy in the last session, we need to consider these aims about why we need to communicate. We need to think about the best way to communicate with and for our target audience. And we need to think about how we measure the effectiveness of our communication. In other words, how do we know that our communication is resonating with the people with whom we are communicating, our target audience? The information that we need to provide during an emergency needs to be succinct, and it needs to meet audience needs and their demands for information. So it needs to be formatted in the appropriate language and context, take into account the multiple values and beliefs that might be within a community. It needs to be respectful, caring, and empathetic. Of course, we understand that it needs to contain the necessary technical information, and within that, we want those messages to be consistent, accurate, and transparent, and come from credible sources. In other words, the spokesperson that you're using, and the organization have to have an honest and good reputation. The information needs to be perceived to be trustworthy people who are sharing that information need to address and mitigate risks associated with misinformation and rumors as they go through a process of active listening. Information during an emergency has to be timely, and of course it has to reach the people with whom we want to communicate. So we need to identify appropriate channels and networks, whether that's peer-to-peer networks or influencers. We need to be communicating frequently and hopefully first, and we need to be agile and flexible in our communication. In other words, we need to provide feedback to concerns as they arise. In order to create a memorable message, we need to start with the why, and then work out to the how and the what. And that's quite the opposite, if you like, from other types of messaging that you might do in other fields, where actually we think a lot about the what rather than the why. In order to think about the why, you have to understand your audience. You have to think about what you want to say, but also what they're going to be interested in, and think about the relevance between the two. And that's not always easy to do. You need to understand where they're coming from. So that is the messaging going to be locally appropriate? Is it going to take into account the context in which they're based? Are you using the appropriate communication vehicle? And have you planned a route to communication? In other words, a model for how your communication will be disseminated, what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, and how it will be received and how it will be measured. And we've covered some of this in the risk communication strategy lecture that you will have seen earlier in this course. Engaging with your audience or audiences is really important, and I can't stress it enough that it's critical that the message are appropriate and sensitive to cultural practices. Engaging early in advance of a crisis is usually the best way. It allows you to build trust, share your interests, share your values, ground truth any assumptions that you might be making about their knowledge or your knowledge. And then it provides a potential route to impact through amplification of that message. Messaging needs to be tested before it's disseminated widely, and then you need to be flexible to adapt that messaging depending on that feedback. In order to engage with different stakeholder audiences, there are lots of ways to do it. You can do it through a questionnaire survey, but most often and appropriate is doing that through interviews, either a one-on-one interview or through focus groups. Interviews can be of short duration intercept interviews, which are conducted really cheaply, or they can be in-depth long interviews where you spend time with individuals, understanding their context and their way of life and livelihoods. Focus groups are probably a little more expensive to conduct, but they are a maximum 6 to 8 people. They're a great way to receive feedback, assess outcomes, and if you're trying to share visions or approaches, it's a great way to reach consensus, as well as a good way of understanding where differences lie and understanding the behaviors and motivations. It's a little more expensive to do. It requires, on both counts for interviews and focus groups, training and expertise and some experience in being able to moderate this, because there are a number of potential pitfalls which we can come to in a minute. When you're designing your message, once you've decided what the objective of your messaging is, it's important that you get to the point and be really clear. So oftentimes we tend to build up to a key message, but in an emergency crisis, those key messages have to be clear and they have to be at the front. If you like, you might imagine an upside down pyramid, where we're trying to get to the point first. Messages need to be short. They need to avoid negative phrasing and potentially negative terms as well. Try and focus on the positive and the solutions that you're trying to find. Active listening is part of a dialogical approach, and it's really important to be able to understand what your audience thinks about the risk, what they're worried about, where the gaps in knowledge are. It helps you inform what to say and do. And it tells you something about people's trust in responders and the authorities who are responding to the emergency. And it also tells you something about the potential opportunities and challenges, or in other words, enablers and inhibitors that might influence the way particular interventions might be taken up. In other words, they might be political, social, economic drivers which might influence whether or not they can actually change their behavior. When you are sharing information visually, you want to illustrate the point, but you want to avoid figures and tables that are overly complicated. You want to keep them nice and clear and talk an audience through a figure of table if you're giving a presentation. Being able to explain what the different symbols are in the image, take them along if it's a graph, the x-axis and the y-axis, and make sure that the scale is correct and legible and understandable. Avoid jargon, be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And it's really important that you assume that your audience is smarter than you are, so that you are approaching this in an empathetic way. Be very transparent about what you know and what you don't know. Uncertainty and risk are difficult to communicate, and of course in early outbreak stages uncertainty is high when data is scarce. When there's high uncertainty, the probabilities and the expected outcomes are unknown, whereas with absolute certainty, the probabilities and expected outcomes are known. In some cases, you can reduce uncertainty if you have more information, but there are some things about which uncertainty won't be able to be reduced, regardless of whether or not better data become available. And it's important to be honest about that and about what you know and what you don't know. Always try to answer the correct question if asked a question. It's not always the question you want to answer. It's not always the question that you can answer, but you need to answer the question that people are asking of you. Acknowledge when you've made a mistake, and acknowledge what you don't know. Make sure that your messaging is accessible through all the right channels, the appropriate networks, and in the right language. And what I mean by that is look at the communication channels that we talked about in a previous lecture on this course. Understand the role of social media inside those channels, but also acknowledge, where there are differences in terms of culturally where people are picking up that information. So it might be that in the farming community, peer-to-peer networks, and there might be influential farming leaders or potentially cultural leaders or religious leaders, which are more important routes of dissemination. And it's your job to understand what those networks and those peer-to-peer influencers are, and try to engage at the outset. Timeliness really matters in a disease emergency, so you need to be able to rehearse these communication channels, understand what the appropriate communication strategies might be in advance, and be able to deploy those immediately. And that means that there's some degree of trust that needs to be built up between yourselves and farmers ahead of or in a pre-crisis phase. Words matter, and so when you are communicating, you need to choose those carefully. Thank you very much, and I'll address any questions inside the lecture. Thank you.